focuses on the Middle East and sort of keeping the journalism there honest. From 1982 to 2004, Richard was a staffer at Forbes, Time, and Fortune magazines. He's gathered more than 20 journalism awards over his career, a 3-decade career, and he was called one of the most dogged of our watchdogs by the late Jack Anderson, who knew a thing or two about watchdogs. He's also put in his bio that none of his great stories have been made into movies yet, so... So he also was involved in Project Klebnikov, which was a media alliance which was committed to shedding light on the murder of the Forbes editor in Moscow, Paul Klebnikov. And he has received the Gerald Loeb Award, the Polk Award twice, the National Magazine Award, Overseas Press Club Award. I think if I continue anymore, I'm going to be completely outclassed. So I'm going to let Richard take it away.
It's a good moment for me to quit. Hi, everyone. This is a cool panel. So when I was invited to do it, I thought this is a great subject and as important now as ever. I think that it's increasing for a couple of reasons. The use by investigative reporters of investigative firms, probes that they're doing and contacting them. There's a lot more interaction, public relations companies. And the reasons, of course, vary, but you've got so many deadline pressures these days with 24/7 news. You've got a lack of resources everywhere for investigative reporting. That's not news to anyone here. And when an investigative reporter receives great information from someone, sometimes on a silver platter, it's a hell of a leg up. But it's only a starting point, hopefully, for good investigative reporters. So I think it's a great thing. I love it when one of these entities calls me, and usually it's one that I've known for many years and have developed a level of trust with. When I was a rookie in the 1980s and 90s, I can count probably on one finger how many times I had a story that was initiated in this way, but now they're a little bit more common for me. But again, and I haven't been steered wrong yet, at least enough to publish something that's embarrassing, but basically that's where the work should begin for a journalist. And I'll say that I'll give one example, and then I'm going to introduce panelists of something where you could get in a lot of trouble by coming to an investigative reporter with a project that a firm has done. In this case, it was I think the 1980s, actually, where a friend at Hill & Knowlton contacted me and said, look, we've got a client. It's a major construction company, and they've got enemies that are... I'm sorry, no, it's the opposite, that this is such a bad company. All right, I got to back up. The client was someone else saying this construction company was awful, and we can give you all this dirt on this construction company. It'd be a great Forbes story. And I said, great, let me see it. And I got deep into the story and suddenly realized, after a lot of reporting, the construction company was the good guy. And, I felt pretty terrible. I had to call my friend before we went to publication, and I said, you're not going to like the story. And she said, why? And I told her. She said to me afterwards that when she hung up the phone, she actually went into the bathroom because she was sick, trying to think of how she's going to explain this to Hill & Knowlton. And since then, I've learned a lesson, which is when a friend comes to you with something on a silver platter for you to investigate, you better say to them, can our friendship withstand this if the opposite is true? Let's talk about that first. So I'll hold off some of my anecdotes for afterwards. I want to introduce everyone. But I want to start with Christine. Christine Richard, she worked for many years as an investigative reporter for Bloomberg, for Dow Jones, And then I think it was a few years ago, maybe 5 years ago, you joined a firm called Indigo, which was a small research firm of basically ex-journalists working at home doing probes and research on hedge funds and having clients. And then a few years ago, you focused entirely for Pershing, Bill Ackman's hedge fund, probing Herbalife. And first I want to ask you, what was the reaction among your colleagues when you left mainstream media outlets to start investigating privately? Were people surprised?
Well, when I was at Bloomberg, I had written a book on another short that this hedge fund, Pershing Square, had been involved with. It was a bond insurance company, so it was part of these companies that created the credit crisis. It was sort of like a mini AIG. So I had spent years, sort of following this short on and off. And so when I left to go to Indigo, it was not to work specifically for Pershing, but just to work for Indigo, which had multiple hedge funds as clients. So I don't think it was. I didn't really get flack for it. In fact, I would say initially I got a lot of phone calls from people saying, "How do you get into this business? Bloomberg is laying off, or Dow Jones is laying off again." And so, yeah, and mostly curiosity, I would say, at the beginning.
Nobody said, "Hey, you're a sellout. What are you doing?"
Well, that comes later. As we get into, you'll see the Herbalife story has become so contentious, and this whole issue of working for hedge funds, doing short research, trying to destroy companies. That stirs up feelings in people, for sure.
Tell us about the Herbalife story and how you... I'm sorry. Tell us about the Herbalife story and how you got involved with Pershing and with Bill Ackman in doing this research. That'd be interesting, that transition and work you did.
Well, so I was working for Indigo, and increasingly on Wall Street there are these investment conferences where hedge funds will get up and they give their best idea. And these have become very common. I mean, 10 years ago there was one or two, and that it's become a fixture on Wall Street. This is a sort of new market-moving event. When these hedge fund managers get together for charity or something, and they talk about the stock they think is going to go up the most, or the stock they think is a hidden fraud. And I can remember going to one of David Einhorn's earlier presentations on Lehman, and he said, gave an elaborate presentation on Lehman, and said at the end of the presentation, it is time for our government to guide Lehman toward a recapitalization. And I think everyone felt like, who are you to say this? And this is, just so presumptuous to be telling our government that they need to look at Lehman. And of course, a year later, it collapsed the whole financial system. So it just seemed like, wow, there's now this whole other format for getting information across to people about companies and about fraud. And so I thought, when I joined Indigo, I had a short list of companies that was suggested. Here's some we think might be worth looking at. And I kind of took the easy way out, and I said, wow, Herbalife, I think I even know that one is a fraud just from, hearing about it over a couple of decades. So took the idea to a bunch of hedge funds, and Bill Ackman was the one who kind of latched onto it as he was going to make it a big public short.
And so these are bad guys, Herbalife, and I'm so sorry. So these...
I'm going to tell a reporter's anecdote. One of the Cal brothers, I forget which one, went to work for NBC after having been a print reporter. He was doing his first live TV interview, and he asked a question. And then it's a professional impulse. You can't resist.
You can tell I'm a print guy. I'm a print guy. But so Herbalife, these are bad guys. They paid, a $200 million fine not long ago. And sorry, yep.
Yeah, so after, it's been now since we first proposed the idea in 2011, so summer of 2016, the FTC finally weighed in and said Herbalife is not a pyramid scheme. So they kind of, this was part of what was clearly an agreement, part of a settlement that the word pyramid scheme would not be leveled against them. But yeah, they will pay a $200 million fine, and they need to change how they do their business. But they're still very much supported, I would say, by Wall Street and by their biggest shareholder, who's Carl Icahn, who came out the day of the settlement, got ahead of the news, and said, good news, the FTC has decided we are not a pyramid scheme. So, you know, and Ted has, of course, made a movie about this whole thing, but it's very interesting when you take these issues to Wall Street instead of the press. You play in like a very different field, and when somebody has $40 billion, which Carl Icahn does, 2040, it kind of changes the outcome. You don't necessarily get that closure, I think, that I was hoping for.
Do you, Christine, have other clients over these couple of years, or is it just Ackman and Pershing?
So for since I left Indigo, this has just been, I have worked just on one company.
Wow,
for one fund.
Investigative reporters, at least I would imagine, would be ringing your phone off the hook wanting information. You're the expert on the subject, right?
Well, I think because Bill Ackman is such a public person, he takes things to the press kind of directly, and I've certainly gotten calls from people who have been interested, and one of them was Ted. But yeah, I mean, I think there is a sort of distrust about if you're doing research for a hedge fund, is it all just going to be, you have such a strong bias? But certainly I've talked to a lot of reporters about, here's something you could look into, here's something, you know, a direction you could go with this in this country or in another country.
And if it's okay to ask, have you shared a lot with journalists who have done pieces ultimately on it? Has Ackman put you in touch with them? How does that work? How does the whole thing work, if you can say?
Yeah, I mean, I think people will, sometimes reporters will say, you know, I would like to have some, you know, it's a big story, it's a big Wall Street story, maybe there's some way this, you know, I'm a reporter in New Mexico, and, you know, I see a lot of Herbalife businesses here. Or, you know, seems to be going on in the UK. So yeah, you do get calls from people, but I think reporters have been reluctant because it became so high profile to say, yeah, I'm jumping in and I'm going to write something supportive of a hedge fund's position.
Okay. Do you think that when you deal with other journalists now, they feel more comfortable with you because of your background at these major financial publications? Does that give you a leg up when you're dealing with reporters now?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. I think that having been a reporter, you sort of understand what's possible for a reporter, what's not going to be possible, what's not going to appeal to them. You know, so I think that is. It definitely is helpful to have been a reporter. I know in the investigative world, often people will come also from like law enforcement or, you know, a lawyer background. And I think sometimes maybe they don't understand the challenges that reporters have in trying to bring a story and all the constraints and how, you know, how your editor is going to react to trying to do this kind of story.
You're solo at your company, but you must need others to help. Do you subcontract to other investigative reporters or others to help you?
Yeah, I have hired, because Herbalife is a sprawling company. It's in 90 countries. It has 2-3 million distributors. So a lot of what we wanted to look at were, you know, how the business was done in, I've looked a lot particularly in Latin America, Colombia, Mexico, Venezuela. So, yeah, hiring freelance reporters who can just go and, take a look and instead of writing an article, write a research report.
All over the world. Wow. And do these reporters, have any of them ever also freelanced pieces at the same time for publications that you're aware of?
No, and I think we would discourage that. Like, we are very clear, like when I'm doing research or when I hire someone to do research, we would always say that we're doing research. It's not like we're going to disguise ourselves as journalists or something, or even as customers, or someone who wants to be a distributor. It has really pretty much been, I'm researching this for investors who are trying to understand it. What can you tell me? Which can be limiting, but I don't think it's good to probably mix those two things, like reporting and researching for a hedge fund.
So they're basically like moonlighting, kind of like cops doing security work at night.
Everyone I've worked with is doing something else in journalism.
It's interesting. I've had opportunities over the years, because I've gotten to know so many major investigative firms and friendly with people at them, where I've gotten calls saying, hey, you know about this subject a lot. We can hire you. We've got some money to pay. Why don't you could make some money and do a report for us and some digging. And I would think to myself, I guess people are doing it, but somehow I can't. Even though I'm not currently on the staff of a publication, I'm on my own. Maybe I'm naive. Maybe I could use the money, but I think to myself, I don't know if I could do that in my own head, because I'm a fossil in the business, and I just feel I'm 24/7 as a mainstream investigative reporter. But what I've done sometimes is say, no, I can't take money, but I do know about the subject. Let's do some swapping of information, info swaps. You guys know about X. Maybe I want to write a story about that someday, or I'll call you down the road, and you've got some information for me. So that's how I've handled that. Interesting. There was a time in the 80s at Forbes when Shorts would constantly call reporters at Forbes and work with them on stories, but that's not happening these days like it did.
You don't think it is? You don't see it?
Is it as common?
I think there are a lot of hedge funds that are still secretive. So they just don't choose to go this public route of taking on a company very publicly, and because there's just all kinds of legal issues and reputational issues, and if you watch Betting on Zero, you'll see sort of what Bill Ackman goes through once he puts himself out there. So a lot of hedge funds don't want to be the catalyst, so they will, call up a reporter, pitch an idea. I don't know if journalists are getting sort of cynical about that. I don't know, but there is then this alternative, which is that the hedge funds just take it, put it on stage themselves once they've done the work, and they give the presentation, and the reporters sit there and decide, are we going to report on this? Are we going to do headlines on this?
Right.
It sort of changes the role, certainly. But I would still think there would be people who are looking at corporate fraud and shorting stocks who are still interested in engaging reporters, because that really is the filter between, is this really just so biased, and this person has been shorting this company for so many years, and their reputation is staked on it, and they have so much money. So the only way to really filter that is to give it to a reporter and say, what do they write? And like in the case with your construction story, right? You wrote exactly what they didn't want you to write.
Yeah.
Or maybe they say, look, this isn't New York Times material. This isn't going to be on the front page of the New York Times. It's just not. In your mind it is, but in our mind it's not. So.
Very good. And Ted, you're also involved in Ted Broad he's the director of Betting on Zero, which premiered at Tribeca Film Festival and received special jury mention for his investigative work. And his first feature film was Darfur Now, which was named one of the 5 best documentaries of 2007 by the National Board of Review and Broadcast Critics Association. And you began, though, in your career, you're now doing nonfiction documentary work, but you began in fiction, and it led to nonfiction. I'd be interested to hear how that all came about.
Yeah, I wound my way into documentary filmmaking somewhat accidentally. I'd gone to graduate school and trained to become a scripted filmmaker. I got a streak of work writing and directing hour-long documentaries for A&E in the early days of cable television. But that had never been my ambition, and I rather happily retreated to writing screenplays. But with that little bit of background, my agent several years ago suggested that Darfur might make a good subject for a documentary, and I had not made that kind of film, had not dealt with an ongoing crisis, and was moved as a matter of sort of conscience by the subject matter, and turned to nonfiction filmmaking and featured documentary at that point, and found the work very satisfying, and the results were good, and that's pretty much where I've remained since. I do continue to write screenplays, but they're all true stories, so this is the world I inhabit now.
It must have been life-changing, Darfur, and you were basically out there investigative film work.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting.
Very risky, very.
It was a very dangerous environment to work in. We negotiated with the government of Sudan, who rather remarkably granted me initially access to go travel around the region and try to identify potential subjects and learn directly what was happening. And then, again, rather remarkably, they allowed us with a very small film crew to go film. And I spent the better part of 5 months there. It was a dangerous environment. Our goal was really not so much to investigate the atrocities that were occurring there. We were rather explicit about that, both as a production and in our dealings with the government of Sudan. Our interest was in bringing to life efforts to resolve the conflict. And that distinction, I think, was significant to the government of Sudan. Our impulse was not explicitly investigative. We weren't trying to uncover truths that were concealed. We were really trying to bring to life, as I said, a desire, an impulse to resolve the conflict, and we were looking for people who were trying to do that. But in the process, of course, I discovered a great deal about what was happening, and a great deal more about the consequences of true stories and bringing them into the world than I had been aware of before.
I would imagine you probably worked with a lot of NGOs.
I did, yeah. Though the government gave us permission to travel there, having a non-aligned, or at least a non-governmental actor to help us just literally navigate through Darfur was important. And the NGOs that we worked with, of course, had an agenda of their own. They were in different ways trying to keep people alive, trying in some cases to bring to the larger world nuances and details of a crisis that would mobilize support and obviously help serve their organization's goals. But in those cases, with both the government of Sudan and with the NGOs, the World Food Program and the International Rescue Committee, who were very helpful to us, I was explicit with them that I, am interested in what they're doing. To the extent that I'm able, we'll try to bring their story into the film, but I couldn't guarantee it, that their story or their people would be in the film. In the case of the International Rescue Committee, despite a great deal of effort on my part to find someone within the organization that would make sense for the film, we weren't able to, and they were disappointed, explicitly disappointed that we weren't able to, but understood and were ultimately, I think, very pleased with the film.
I've been in situations in Africa also where you deal with government, you deal with NGOs. It can be very dicey. It's sort of, everyone's got an agenda, and I have to
Yeah.
somehow figure out if I'm being spun and by who. And in Congo, I was in Congo, where there are more NGOs in Congo than I think there may be businesses. An editor of a magazine there told me they refer to them as sucking pumps on the economy, like they keep the economy going in Kinshasa.
Yeah.
And that was tough. So did you find you were being misled by anyone, either in government on the one hand or NGOs on the other?
I don't remember.
Or exaggeration?
Less exaggeration or misleading than inflected. It became clear to me in a way that I had never experienced before, because this was the first time I'd covered or been involved with an international crisis. Many of you, it's your stock and trade. For me, it was a first-time visit. But I really became aware of how sort of narrowly focused a lot of the stories, the journalism, the television reporting, how narrowly focused that story was when it came to the Darfur crisis, and how much terrain of the experience of the people of Sudan, as well as the conflict within the government of Sudan, which was always portrayed as monolithic, and the conflict between the government and other international players, what a narrow band of that experience was making its way to the West, and how the terms of this very complex crisis were, of necessity, being translated into language that the West could understand. I mean, the tribal conflicts which were central to the Darfur crisis, in which the government of Sudan had manipulated to foment, the kind of killings that were to their advantage, were portrayed in terms that a Western audience could understand, but that really transformed what was actually happening. I mean, the West found a kind of shorthand to call this a conflict between Arabs and Africans, which kind of inflected it into a larger, discussion having to do with Islam in the West. And I think a lot of people reading about that were thinking, oh, these are somehow, Muslim Arabs and non-Muslim Africans, and that helped them understand the conflict. In fact, everybody involved in the Darfur conflict were Muslims. And Arab-African sort of played into a sort of racial dimension. Somehow Africans were more dark-skinned and Arabs were light-skinned. Well, this, again, helped the story play in the West, but it had nothing to do with the realities. And what was startling by the time I got there, which was a few years after this crisis had gone on, was that in order to communicate with the West, a lot of the affected parties were starting to use these terms to describe what was happening, when if you actually sat down and talked with folks, you got an entirely different picture and a much more nuanced picture of what was happening. And so, like I said, it wasn't so much that I was being spun or that I was being lied to. It was, I became aware of how things were being inflected in a certain way to serve various agendas, whether it was just getting a story out so it was comprehensible to an audience, or whether it was serving, fundraising aims of aid organizations, that sort of thing.
What I have found useful in my career is I've dealt with whistleblowers, I've dealt with people coming forward in corporations to reveal corruption, and people. It's very rare that you have someone pure, but sometimes you do, who just wants to expose the corruption. Period, wants nothing for themselves. But what I found useful sometimes is to just confront it head on. I'll say, okay, everyone's got an axe to grind. I need to know your axe. And then we'll take it the next step. I need to know what it is. Just tell me. Even if it's off the record, tell me what your axe is. And actually, sometimes they even answer. Yeah. And did you use any corporate investigative firms in Africa? I find it very valuable when I go to troubled countries. The first thing I usually do is I call the U.S. Embassy, so they know I'm around in case something happens. And I ask for a backgrounder with the economics section. So off the record, they tell me what's going on in this place, and they have some sources that they recommend. They're curious what I'm working on, especially if nothing really is going on in the country. And they're helpful, but of course, you also have to look at what is their agenda, too, at the same time. my next stop will be usually calling up one of the biggest corporate investigative firms out there. You know, I was in Jakarta. I thought, okay, who's here? Oh, Control Risk has an office here. Okay, let me call the Control Risk folks and go in there and have a drink with them, because they're probably going to know a lot of stuff that's going on in this place, and that could be helpful too. But you didn't find, NGOs were primarily, and the government were the primary sources with agendas. You didn't have investigative firms, public relations firms?
Not that I dealt with in that situation. With the Herbalife film, it was a little bit different, but in Sudan, no. And another point here, Rich, that's worth making is that the Darfur film, and to a somewhat lesser extent, but in intent, Betting on Zero, were both attempts to bring to life, using the tools of documentary filmmaking, an ongoing struggle. And so while I would talk to people for information, and you know, it was almost always on condition of background, that this was not going to appear in the film, they had confidence that it wasn't going to appear in the film, because the only thing that was going to appear in the film were the people that were in it. You know, it really didn't exist until the cameras were there and turned on in that type of filmmaking. Jim and Elise were talking in the earlier panel about how, you know, when you're doing a sort of historical documentary, or where you're gathering information that's going to be presented as part of a narrated experience for a documentary audience, you're in a slightly different terrain. But in Darfur Now, and to a somewhat lesser extent, but still largely in Betting on Zero, what the audience experiences, and what I tell the subjects and the people that I'm talking to, is, you know, is what happens when the camera is on. So so that kind of investigative work and is something that it gets handled a little differently. At least it has in the case of those two films. But to answer your question explicitly, no, I didn't talk to any private firms, investigative firms, for the Darfur story.
Let's talk about the Herbalife story, and that's where your world intersects with Christine as well, and how that all came about. It's being shown on Friday night.
Yes, you can all see it Friday night at 8:30, National Portrait Gallery. I hope you'll come. I had wanted to collaborate with the producer Glenn Zipper, and we had a film about a singer-songwriter that ran aground because of financing. We couldn't find someone to put it together, and he was introduced to a guy named John Fickthorne, who was interested in financing feature documentaries, but specifically feature documentaries set in the world of corporate conflict, American corporate conflict. He thought this was an underrepresented area, and an area that was fascinating to him. He kind of wanted to be involved in filmmaking for a while, and had a ton of ideas. And so Glenn said, I'm under a non-disclosure agreement. I can't just come and sit, and I'll let you read something. And so we met, and for half an hour, he watched me read 15 single-spaced pages of ideas. And wow. in amongst there were 2 or 3 sentences about the battle between Herbalife and Bill Ackman. And that sparked my interest. I said, the rest of this stuff doesn't appeal very much to me, but that seems like the sort of charged, surprising conflict that would sustain a feature documentary. And so, he said, well, how would you go about doing it? What would you do? And I, said, let me look into it, but my basic take would be, to present the conflict and to get the audience in the shoes of these different, very motivated, powerful players and watch what happens, because something's going to happen. At that point, Ackman's short had been on for about 6 months, a little less actually, and everyone anticipated that something major was going to happen within a year or so, and that seemed like a really good time frame for a feature documentary. Well, as it happened, it took 2.5 years, and it required, and Herbalife's unwillingness to cooperate required me to shift the approach that I took in the film, but that was how it got started.
And how did you intersect on this with Christine?
With Christine?
She's investigating this company for Ackman.
Yeah.
And you come into the scene as really an investigative filmmaker.
Well, I was again, my impulse in the filmmaking initially was not investigative. I was trying to learn about the subject so I could, the subject in general, so I could figure out who I might want to include in the film. And I became aware of Christine very early on because the Indigo report, which she had authored, was a fundamental piece of research and a fundamental motivator for Ackman having taken his short, and was referred to in one of the first big pieces on the short, which a guy named William Cohen, who writes for Vanity Fair, had published and which I had read. And so I was able to read Christine's Indigo report and then met her on one of my first trips to New York to discuss with the financier how this was all going to, unfold. And Christine knew our financier, and so we met, and I got to know her better. But at that point, had no intention of including her in the film. It was just not the way I saw the film. So,
but that evolved. That evolved into.
Yeah.
You're in the film.
Yes. Interviewed, and we follow her around doing some work for a while. So.
And Ackman's in the film.
And Christine and Ackman are together in a major presentation, which sort of forms the structural backbone of the film.
Okay. So now you're in a position where you have Ackman and you have Christine working for Ackman, so they have an agenda.
Yes.
And how did you sort through that in your documentary?
Well,
and where
I was appreciative but skeptical. I don't know how to put it. I mean, I initially, as I was getting my bearings in the story, was very grateful for the information that Christine had already produced, and talked with her and asked her, questions about what she was doing, and was grateful when she steered me to talk to other people. But I also did my own work and, tried to the best of my abilities to find as many other sources of information as I could to sort of double check and verify the kind of information that I was getting from her. So.
Was Ackman equally skeptical? Was he saying, I don't know if I want to get involved in this or be on film? What are you doing?
He himself
promised me I'll look good in it.
Well, he himself was fairly willing to participate from my first meeting with him, but his advisors, the people that work for him at Pershing, were they ranged from skeptical to adamantly opposed, and so navigating that resistance against his own willingness to appear in the film was a challenge, and it was a difficult one. He's a sophisticated guy. He works in the public eye a lot. He's aware of the perils of that and enjoys navigating those perils. But the hedge fund world is not is generally, I think you can back this up, Christine, most of the people that manage money for other people as well as their clients don't like to be in the papers. They generally try to stay below the radar. And Bill is something of an exception, which is part of what makes him such an interesting subject.
Interesting. Glenn Simpson. I had an order that I was going to actually talk to them, and they sat in that order, which is, I don't know how that happened, but Glenn and I have known each other a long time. It's 1994, I think, 20 years ago, in Little Rock, Arkansas, covering Clinton, Whitewater, which ended up being mostly about nothing. But we were down there. He was with the Wall Street Journal, and arguably, for my money, the best investigative reporter that the Wall Street Journal's had, at least in my lifetime. And but now you're not. You sold out. Now you're at GPS, Fusion GPS, and I want to know, first of all, would you take me aboard? No. How did it all come about that you started this, and why?
We don't use the word sold out. We use the word cashed in. No, just kidding. I left because the industry changed, and the journal in particular changed, and my job became a lot less fun. So I like to say I didn't leave the industry, that it left me. And I wanted to continue doing what I enjoyed doing, which is a certain type of investigations around financial crime and political corruption. And it occurred to me, this was in 2009, and it occurred to me that there was a lot less resources being devoted to these subjects by newspapers, but the amount of financial crime and fraud was increasing. And typically the victims of these crimes are people with money, not poor people. And they're willing to spend more money to expose these kind of things, even if it doesn't mean getting their money back. So that was sort of the premise of the business, was that there was people who would pay for the kind of investigative work that journalists do, which is more geared at exposing things than it is sort of classic corporate intelligence. Right? Classic corporate intelligence, there's a lot of information that a company will acquire that they use to make a business decision. And a lot of that is sort of unprintable stuff that you get from interviewing ex-employees and that kind of thing. Journalists don't really do that kind of stuff. What I really like to do is gather documents and put things together in a way that they could be used to expose a crime or right or wrong. And so that's sort of the premise of our business. It's kind of the opposite of Christine's in that we have a bunch of different clients across a range of issues, it's about 10 people now, and we work with reporters sometimes, and frequently, it has nothing to do with media. It's asset recovery and high dollar litigation and that sort of thing.
So working as an investigative reporter privately for the client, not necessarily going to work its way into the media reports.
Right. I call it journalism for rent sometimes. It's, we like to do things in a journalistic way because I think it's a very effective method for, figuring things out. It's very sort of, try to stay really disciplined around the sort of things that discipline a newspaper reporter, like you guys were talking about. People who've never been a reporter don't understand the challenges of printing what you know, right? Because you can't just say what you know, you have to say how you know it, and you have to be able to prove it. And so that imposes a sort of discipline to the investigative process that people in other fields don't really absorb. And so when you're a spy, you never have to really get into a lot of that stuff. So that's how we do our work, for private clients. And I think that when I explain our method to people, they find that very reassuring. Because if you're working for a law firm and you're litigating something complex, they love to hear that you're obsessed with documents, right? And that you really want to, be able to prove what it is you're trying to say.
Glenn is an example of a corporate or risk investigator now who, if he called me on the phone, I'd probably ring him back within a minute to hear what he has, if he's got a subject that he thinks I should pursue, because we have a relationship. He's an excellent journalist, so I know he's not going to spin me, and he's going to know what a good story is. So there's that relationship. When you were at the Journal, did you find any corporate PI types coming to you with a story that worked out to be a great piece in the end, or blew up in some terrible way? Do you remember?
I'm trying to think. The short answer is yes to the first question and no to the second. I've witnessed a number of blow-ups. I'm not sure I've ever really participated in one. I think probably just good luck, but I think my experience is somewhat like yours. When I was a younger reporter, most of my stories were self-generated because I didn't have any sources and no one knew who I was. As you get older and you develop a repertoire and get known for doing something specific, people with information in that area will come to you. So I did a lot of stories about money laundering, crooked banks, financial crime, financing terrorism, tax evasion. So people would come to me with complex stories about, big, financial crimes. And that is, in fact, how I, ended up in the business. Was people would come to me and I would work with them, and I learned how their business worked, and I realized there was a business there and then there were things about their business that I didn't like, and that were not that appealing to me. There's a whole side of the investigations business that involves like due diligence and these other things I find kind of boring. And so I decided, when the journal, this was after Rupert Murdoch had taken over the journal, and the paper was in great turmoil, and they were not sure they were interested in a lot of investigative reporting, and certainly weren't interested in people who wanted to investigate the kind of people Rupert Murdoch hangs around with. So I decided at that point to try to sort of a hybrid of journalism and corporate intelligence, based on many years of thinking, if I could do this myself, how would I do it?
Do you have clients that range from governments to corporations, political parties, every conceivable thing?
There's not much money in campaign, sort of traditional campaign opposition research type stuff, so we don't do much of that. Sometimes there are big issue campaigns or big elections where there's a lot of money thrown around, but most of the time, and also it's a commoditized kind of cannibalized business because there's a lot of free labor. There's a lot of kids around who want to do that kind of stuff, so you really can't compete with that sort of. So we don't do sort of traditional campaign stuff very often, but we do a lot of policy battles, and the corporate conflict, I think, is a great summary of. A lot of our business is corporate conflict, and sometimes I call it trucks versus trains, where you have two industries or two big companies that are going at it. They're, kind of morally neutral. It's the trucks versus the trains, and so there's a lot of that in Washington, right? People, sometimes it's rent-seeking behavior, sometimes it's just regulatory battles, competitive battles, that sort of thing. So there's a big chunk of that. There's a big chunk of high-dollar litigation. And then, which is, and then sometimes there's funds that are engaged in interesting investment strategies or pursuits. So we do, some of those are great, sort of, they're fun because, as Christina's experienced, they go on for a long time, and there's a real interesting sort of narrative arc to the whole process, which does lend to storytelling, too. So there's all of those things, and then we do, some run-of-the-mill stuff like, we had a company that won a judgment against a company in Taiwan, and the Taiwanese company wouldn't pay, and they wanted to know, how can we get our money? And so we had to identify, the ways that this Taiwanese company was continuing to operate in the United States undercover, and find assets that they controlled that you could go into court and argue were under their control and grab them. And so
it sounds like it could have been a good Forbes story. Why didn't you call me?
This was, two companies you never heard of, right?
Okay.
Squabbling over $20 million, right?
I do that every day.
Anyway, I did want to add, though, that,
Planned Parenthood, I want you to...
We can talk about Planned Parenthood.
That was quite a...
That one's been in the papers, so yeah, it's an easy one. Relatively easy one to talk about. And I think kind of a good example of the way we do things, which is we never, we're not a PR firm. We don't like to be thought of as a PR firm. We don't ever sign contracts for public relations. And so, but of course, a lot of people that we do work for, ultimately would like to see it in the public, whether it's in a court filing or in a newspaper article. And in any event, so we were hired by Planned Parenthood to help them understand what was happening to them. And they were the subject of a, rabid pro-life investigative operation that was undercover video. And it was a classic example of sort of like how people can be manipulative and unhanded under the guise of journalism or investigations, right? It was a fake journalism, right? It's because people were posing as journalists and acting like journalists or claiming to act like journalists, and in fact doing things that journalists never do, right? Manufacturing fake IDs, right? Engaging in all kinds of identity fraud and other things. But the central mystery of this was, that there was a discrepancy between what was on the tapes and what the people who were the targets of who worked in these clinics said really happened. And so, the client wanted us to unravel that and ideally prove that the tapes were doctored in some kind of digital way. So we're generalists, right? Journalists are generalists. I'm not a digital forensics guy, but we do know how to find them, and so we found some, and we quickly sort of found. No, we eventually found. I won't say quickly. Sort of what we suspected, which was not that the tapes were digitally altered, but that they were edited. And as any journalist knows, the editing process, someone can be made to look awfully guilty in the editing process. Who isn't, right? Or vice versa. They can, it's a question of selection. So we ultimately came back to them. We said, the bad news is these people really did say what is on this tape, right? These unfortunate, tasteless kind of comments. But, as if you've ever transcribed a tape from an interview, you know that in the course of a casual conversation, people will say tasteless things or things that are regrettable, especially in isolation, right? But then if you listen to the whole tape, it doesn't seem so crass or so awful, right? And sure enough, we were able to, with the help of some guys formerly from the FBI, find a lot of evidence that these tapes had been selectively edited and that things had been removed. And we couldn't prove what had been removed because everyone was operating just based on their memory of these encounters. No one had a full tape, but we were able to say, look, the imperative here strategically to defend yourself is to demand the full tapes and to insist on full disclosure, right? And say, we don't want to suppress any of this. We want it all out there. So we want everyone to see the whole thing. And that did prove to be the sort of checkmate move here. And in fact, those tapes have never been made public because, we know what they'll show in broadly, which is, yeah, these people said these things, but that they were the tapes were selectively edited in a manipulative way. And so, they were up on the hill in some vault.
It was a hell of a case of yours that made headlines.
And the only other thing I'll add is the reason that we're talking about it here is because, ultimately the organization was trying to defend itself and asked us to give an interview to the New York Times about all of this, which ended up putting into the public domain. And was a sort of turning point moment.
Hong Chung, hi. By the way, your line, Glenn, about I didn't leave the industry left me. If the industry keeps going the way it is, I may follow what you're doing. But Hong is born and raised in China, undergraduate student in journalism in China, and then in 2011, you came to Columbia University, got a master's in public affairs, international public affairs, and then 2013, a fellowship in Africa where you were investigating, going undercover, the rhino horn trade, right? So you were a journalist, but at the same time an NGO and was involved in that at the same time, right?
Yeah, it's a little complicated. Maybe I can just briefly help you understand.
We're in a complicated world nowadays.
Yeah. So how I started, so my focus is always Chinese overseas investment and social environmental related conflicts. How I started was in 2011. I heard there was one Chinese hydropower company destroying one of the most beautiful waterfall in Ecuador. So as a journalist, I was very curious. I went there, spent 1 month doing investigation, and then I wrote a story published on Southern Weekly, which is like the equivalent of the New York Times in China. And that was the first time this kind of like Chinese companies, environmental conflicts, huge story was published in Chinese media. And what I realized is that, so during that month, many people talk about the story. The Hong Kong Stock Exchange, they intervened and they started to do investigation. But after almost like a month, people forget about it. In 2012, something similar happened. I did a story in Peru about a Chinese company and the labor conflict. I still remember what the general manager of that Chinese company told me. Hong, your story is good for media, but if you are in my position, you are going to see more. So all this make me very curious about, is there anything more I could do? So that's why in 2013, after I got a chance to come to Africa, I did a story about ivory rhino horn trade. I started a social enterprise called China House, which focusing on helping Chinese company integrate into Africa to reduce those conflicts.
And that's in Kenya.
Yes, we're based in Kenya.
Hopefully will be a for-profit company.
Yes.
For you. So you're running this, and you're doing work that reporters would be interested in as well, right? So your reporters are coming to you, or you're interesting them. You're a former journalist, NGO, now a for-profit, a lot of hats, and working with journalists to expose this stuff in Africa as well.
Well, I would say, like, because of the journalism skill and experience that I have, so later on it comes with there's some projects that I realized I could be of some help. For example, I was involved in a lot of ivory and rhino horn trade investigation with my colleague Andrea and so on. Because of my background as a journalist, the skills I have, and also my face as a Chinese person, I realized there's many things that I can contribute that may be able to make some difference. So that's why I got involved in those kind of projects.
When journalists call you up because they're interested in this subject, does the fact that you were once a journalist help in terms of trust with your information?
Well, I would say, like, having a background of journalist, I feel like the good advantage of myself is that I understand what kind of things would be interesting to media and journalists. And also, I understand, like, for example, when it comes to the topic about Chinese people in Africa, you know, a lot of journalists, they have this difficulty in getting interviews, getting quotes, by actually talking to those Chinese companies to understand what is the real things going on. I understand how difficult it is for journalists, because even for me as a Chinese person, it was extremely difficult. It's much easier for me to go to like a Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Africa, Latin America, than going into a Chinese embassy for me as a Chinese person. So that's why later on I would be very open when media from like BBC, CNN and so on, when they do stories about related topic, when they say they need an interview, I'm always very open to them. So I would say that's how it is.
You and Andrea have connections that we'll get into also. Andrea, you spent a career not as an NGO until a few years ago, right? You were in professional, academic, business career, and then a few years ago formed Wild Leaks, no relation to WikiLeaks,
not at all.
Which does a lot of sensitive undercover work with undercover cameras in various countries around the world, exposing some of this wildlife outrage with horns and tusks, right? And their movie is being shown here as well.
Tonight.
That's tonight.
Yeah, very game.
So you're an investigative documentary maker, but you were telling me before that you're a hybrid, which is very interesting, and I want people to hear this.
I'm not a documentary maker. I had a parallel career in conservation with a master degree in biology and zoology, but I also had master in business administration. So I worked for a long time, to make a long story short, as a consultant to governments and large corporations and on issues like high-level security, homeland security, cybersecurity investigation and intelligence. And then 3 years ago, I merged these two words, conservation and security intelligence, under one NGO called Elephant Action League here in the US. And Wild Leaks is a project of Elephant Action League and has to be seen in the context of the core activities of Elephant Action League, which are basically intelligence gathering and investigation on wildlife crime, wildlife and forest crime. So Wild Leaks is one of the tools we have to get information that later on can be used either to help other entities or to start our own investigation, like it happened last year in China with the undercover investigation.
So I'm sorry, I was mistaken before when I thought you were investigative documentaries, but
no,
you're not doing that.
The filmmaker is here in this room, and then that was this sort of collaboration for almost 2 years when an entity like ours, so NGO, had to very happily welcome a filmmaker.
Are you working with journalists? Because it sounds really interesting, especially this hybrid of endangered species trade and security and cyber and
I work with a lot of former intelligence and law enforcement officers who helped me to conduct this undercover investigation. Right now we are operating between Africa and Asia. And we constantly receive, I constantly have emails from all kind of reporters and media, and wanted to, but it's difficult because first of all, it's not easy to be embedded in an undercover investigation that lasts for maybe a year and a half in China.
You mean for a journalist to be embedded?
Yeah. So the director here Richard can vouch for that. It's not easy for them, and it's not easy for us because, you go to meeting with traffickers, you do all kind of tricks that he was talking before that journalists don't do, but we do all the time. So not easy for both parties. There has to be a high level of trust and a high level of collaboration. But then if the marriage is successful, then the outcome is extremely powerful. So although our mission is not to we don't do what we do for an article at the end of the day. We do that, it's our approach is, you can define it as prosecution-driven, intelligence-led approach. So at the end of the day, we want people in jail. And this is how we build the investigation. But the media, at the end of the day, is the most powerful tool that we have, although...
Are you going to embed investigative reporters on this stuff?
Sorry? Yeah, we have a project now that we are launching right now. Instead of reaching out to media and reporters towards the end of our investigation or after our investigation to try to share, to have them embedded in our team since the beginning. Okay. We have a project both for accomplished reporters, for complex investigation, long and across multiple countries, and also for students. We would love to have.
And Hong is undercover with you? Does he go?
Hong was undercover with me, and now because of the film that you will see tonight, his face will be all over the places. He will become extremely dangerous for him to keep doing what he's doing. So he's still working with us, but more in the background.
Very interesting. I'm sorry, Ted, you had a question?
No, I was just, one of the things that it occurred to me listening to Andrea and Hong talk is that, at least for me as a filmmaker, one of the ways I can sort of openly acknowledge the work of investigative reporters or researchers or NGOs is including them in the film. Rather than adopting their point of view explicitly as a filmmaker, I can bring their work into the film and make that a subject of the film, and allow the audience to sort of gauge the investigation and the impulses behind it as they weigh the actions of one of the players in the documentary as it's unfolding. And that was ultimately what I ended up deciding to do with Christine, with her consent and collaboration. And it's a little bit different dynamic, I think, as a filmmaker, that relationship than the kind of one that you're asking, which is getting information from someone and doing something with it. I don't know how the rest of you all feel. I mean, if that pertains to the kind of work you do, Glenn, or not. I mean, it's a slightly different thing when you're...
I mean, as someone who's been in media, I've sort of experienced both things, which is, we don't... it's usually not the point of what we do, but we're comfortable doing it if it's what the client wants. Mostly we just... don't seek attention for ourselves, and the part of journalism that I really loved, I loved seeing my name in the paper on the front page when I was in my 20s and 30s, and my parents really loved it, and but it gets old, and what never gets old is the sort of puzzle solving, process,
right, the actual practice of it,
the intellectual curiosity, fulfilled, and all of that, and so. I'm perfectly comfortable doing whatever is in the best interest of the project, and that is only a minority of times is it about us.
I'd be curious. You guys, I haven't seen the film. I'm going to see it tonight. you were partners with the filmmakers in this endeavor. Did you have any questions about your relationship with the filmmaker and whether or not your points of view would be fully represented? How did you navigate those questions? Because you in particular, Hong, it sounds like you had a great deal at stake here.
Well, to be honest, when I was thinking about joining the film, at the beginning I was having some concern, but because some of the colleagues I have, like Ophia, someone really recommend me, this director is really good, he's very open-minded. Because as you may be aware of, like when it involves the topic of the ivory trade, and China, this is a little bit kind of like a relatively sensitive topic, especially for Chinese people, because the relationship between the ivory trade and China. So, and at the moment, or I would say for a long time, a lot of the Chinese people, when they hear about Western NGO or media, for example, like the New York Times, when they publish the stories about Xi Jinping and ivory and airplane, a lot of Chinese people would believe this is anti-China Westerners trying to use this to attack China, and they're manipulating a lot of the facts in order to do so. So, yeah, so at the beginning, I would be concerned that whether I will also be represented in this way, but later on, as I get to know more and more about the filmmaker, my concern disappeared.
Now, the director of the documentary had to develop a level of trust with you guys not being journalists, investigative journalists, so that must have taken a while to develop a trust, or was it instant? Agendas, all of that?
Well, it took 1.5 years to establish that trust before we actually started.
Wow.
1.5
Wow.
years of building a relationship and research and planning.
My gosh.
Before we went in and actually started to go into dangerous situations.
That's amazing. There's a lot of marriages that don't last that long.
He had access to in our case, he had access to our most treasured sources. In the film, you will see some of them.
Can't wait to see these movies.
It's not something that you do overnight. You
Wow,
you have to.
that's great.
Yeah.
Should we open the floor to questions, or should we just tell war stories? Do people have questions? Please.
I'm curious about your comments on Chinese journalism. Because you were talking, went to Columbia, so if you could talk about the differences between doing journalism in China versus journalism in Western journalism. And do you see journalism becoming more and more professional in China in the future, or will the current government repress serious journalism in China?
Well, I guess that kind of question is very typical. Like the moment I arrived in the US, I received a lot of questions from my friends from all over the world. And if you ask my comment, I would say, to be honest, I think no matter journalism in China or in the world, they all have their good part and bad part. And for example, bias is all over the world. Like I would say for Chinese media and Chinese reporting, they are not much more biased than American journalists. I have met a lot of very biased and problematic American journalists too. So I guess people are all becoming more and more professional, no matter in China or in anywhere else. Thank you.
Ouch. Are there other questions? Easy questions? No? Should we just tell a few war stories then? We've got a little more time. Question in the back.
Apart from financial malfeasance and corruption, what are the other kind of areas of journalism, filmmaker collaboration that you see promising?
I mean, we are looking at some ideas of cases. There's, I think, there are a lot of powerful stories in environmental crime, and we've done some cases in that area. Product liability cases. I think that the sort of corporate crime generally against the public There's all kinds of. I mean, I don't want to give away some of our best ideas, but there, I'm talking to a documentary maker the other night who's doing a thing about a poor region of the country that is horribly polluted by a nuclear plant, and that kind of quiet epidemic that really lends itself both to the filmmaking medium, because you have human beings who are very sympathetic and have been horribly wronged, and you also have a mystery that has got complexity to it that takes place over a number of years. There's any number of pharmaceutical cases, companies peddling dangerous substances, and I think factory farming is another one that has already led to some really great documentary work, and I think that the sort of obesity crisis and the health crises in the United States are a big issue.
Great stuff.
Yeah, and then there's litigation in general. I mean, there's kind of civil action style litigation tales that I think are really big for this medium. I think that overall, I think that one of the most exciting things that's happened in journalism and is the explosion in the documentary film market. And people love to watch this stuff. My kids are super into all kinds of nonfiction, documentary television, and it's a great thing for all of us who, have otherwise seen our industry really, suffer for lack of interest and lack of financing. So, I mean, we've worked with a number of broadcast and film organizations to help them develop stuff. A lot of people who sort of drifted into that out of print investigative journalism because it's where the money is and where all the action is right now.
We should talk after this event. Are there more questions? Yes, in the third row. Hi.
Question is for you about China again. Given the sentiment about Western journalists in China that you mentioned, what kind of an impact do you think that this film can have in China on the ivory trade or the powers that can regulate the ivory trade?
Actually, that's another thing related to. So when I still remember at the very beginning when I met Richard, we were discussing whether my face should be pixel in this film, which is of course safer for me and my career as an investigator. But the reason why I believe it's better the other way is that usually in all the films on this kind of topic I have seen, it's usually this narrative. So white people being the very good people, African people being the bad people, and Chinese people being the worst people. So, and that's not really objective. And this kind of narrative really offends a lot of Chinese people. That's what makes a lot of Chinese people believe all these NGOs are terrible people, although they are not. So I believe by having some different kind of Chinese people in this film, making it more balanced and more objective, is going to help more Chinese understand and be more comfortable with this topic, which is my big hope.
Is it going to actually air in China?
It's a Netflix film, so it will air wherever is Netflix. Netflix is currently not in China. They're in Hong Kong, and we are hoping that we will find a way to get the film into China through Netflix. Because it's Netflix owned, it goes wherever they are, and they have 83 million subscribers, which is very good. But they're still negotiating, and I don't know if this film will be the right film to open the doors, because it is critical of what's going on in China. We're very glad we have Hong in the film, giving a very good face for China, so that will help a lot. But, there's some accusations going on, and there's a lot of proof that Chinese are openly trading ivory and faking certificates, and there's a lot of things that they, will feel very embarrassed about. So we will see. We are hoping that there's a film festival in Beijing in March, where we hope to be screening there. That would be great, and that could open a door for, a release there. So.
Andreas, some of your work actually created headlines in the media about links between ivory trade and terrorism, but they were controversial stories ultimately. some came out and said, no, it's nonsense, it's not true, and the media was fooled. What happened with all of that? Where's the truth in that? Do you know?
It's an investigation that myself and another and a colleague, a friend, did in 2009, 2010 on the links between the illegal traffic of ivory and the Somali terrorist group Al-Shabaab. So what had happened is that we naively thought that we have done this thing, self-funded, over a year and a half, and while being in Kenya on a security assignment for my past work, working with a prominent Somali politician, we had access to a lot of Somali sources through his clan and sub-clan, and that's why we could do these things. But we couldn't explain a lot of the context around the investigation because we didn't want to jeopardize the sources. We couldn't mention these politicians. So we went out with a very famous article published at the very beginning of 2013. The article remained basically dormant until the Westgate attack in Nairobi later in fall. And then the whole thing exploded simply because of what we found 5 years ago. And then I felt what happened is that the two camps, pro and against, completely hijacked our story. So I don't feel the story belongs to us anymore because they start talking about it. I don't know how many articles they publish and not even once they bother to contact us before and ask what we thought and what he had more, or show us the videos, which we have, undercover videos, meeting this Somali.
So that's
a learning experience for me.
That's an example of an NGO triggering major media pieces that then took off.
Yeah, and then a month ago we put out a report 5 years later. You can find it online, exactly to counter, a few of the critics. But it went already, completely crazy, and it's difficult now to talk about it.
Another question?
Yes. My question is for Hong Juan as well. In fact, it's kind of a follow-up of a question that was raised before. Do you really think that that type of documentary can have an effect on the public opinion, which can itself have an effect on, I would say, a company like the Chinese National Petroleum Corporation? I'm thinking of that documentary that was made, that was released last year but censored after a few days, after it had been viewed by about 300 million people in China, which was the documentary Under the Dome. I do work actually in a place in Niger which suffers from the activity of the Chinese National Petroleum Corporation on a population of small antelope in the desert, actually the Sahara Desert. And I showed the documentary to African activists. They were mesmerized by the proximity they could have through a documentary like that. And they were asking me, they said, but do you think that we can, at some point, have a bond, something forming between the Chinese civil society, despite the censorship, and ourselves?
Well, to answer that question, I think there's so the fact is this: China is definitely the biggest ivory market in the world. However, the Chinese people who would be buying ivory trade, who say would be supportive of ivory trade, I would say it would be less than 0.1% of Chinese people in China. The truth is, because we have been working with a lot of Chinese people, there are many Chinese people, they care about wildlife conservation, they love elephants, and there are many Chinese people, they are willing. For example, a lot of my Chinese friends that assist me in a lot of those investigation projects that I have to do. So one big obstacle now for Chinese people to be really engaged on this conservation topic is the lack of understanding about what it is, who those NGOs are, like who are they, what's their motivation, and also the narrative that is twisted a little bit. For example, censorship is not really a big problem in terms of ivory trade. Like, ivory is not something political in China at all, so there's not much censorship about it. What Chinese people and Chinese government is not happy about it is not because some people would say, oh, China, you have problem. Every country has problem. It's the fact that many of the truths are not revealed, and it's portrayed as if all Chinese are buying ivory, which helps me a lot in terms of my investigation, because when I go to the market, all the traffickers, they say, oh, Chinese, he must be buying ivory. How can he be not buying ivory? So that helps me a lot. And
We still have time for a couple questions.
A little bit like the same that you did. The impact that Darfur now had on Darfur and the outcome of it, if it did have an impact, and how things changed, you think, from since you did it till now, if things really did change?
So it's a question that has three answers. Probably the most significant of which involves bringing to life the experience of the people inside Sudan who were subjects of the film. The film had 6 different primary subjects: 3 inside Sudan, 1 a NGO, World Food Program guy, and then 2 Darfuris, one the leader of a IDP camp, a sheikh, and the other a woman who had joined the rebels and was working to defend her homeland against the government. For those Darfuris whose story were a part of the film, the life of the film had enormous impact that I can express probably most simply by the reaction of our translator, our domestic translator, who, when he saw the film, he was looking at a cut. We were checking on subtitling to make sure everything had been done accurately. He's a tough guy. He had lost a lot of his family and had fled Darfur, a very difficult journey, and had come and was working in the United States. After he saw a cut of the film, he excused himself and went outside. It was California. It was a sunny day, and he left the dark editing room, and I stepped out there, and he was in tears. He would really lost control of himself. And when he pulled himself back together, he said, now they can't say this is not true. Now they can't say this isn't happening. And so for Abu Shanab and for the many other Darfuris who felt that there was doubt, they now had a film that represented their actual experience, because we had gotten into Sudan and had brought that experience to life. It wasn't just a tale told. It was something the viewers had experienced. And I think, looking back on the experience of making the film, that mere fact, is something that I can feel very good about as a human being, and that I feel as a filmmaker gave the work lasting meaning. Another effect of the film has to do with the people that were working outside Sudan. We had portrayed the life of a young activist. He was just gotten out of college. He was trying to get legislation passed that would, in a very sophisticated way, sanction investments in Sudan. It would limit the ability of federal and state pension funds to invest in companies that were doing business there. It was sophisticated legislation. We portrayed him trying to get that passed through the state of California. He was successful. And after the film was out, he was able to use the film to help promote similar legislation domestically and nationally. And 18 other states, more than half the states in the United States, passed legislation modeled on California. And President Bush, then President Bush, signed into law a federal bill that protected those investment laws, which was significant. So in that regard, there was some sort of quantifiable, notable change. In addition, we profiled the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, and at a very critical juncture in the Darfur crisis internationally, the film was screened at the UN, and the Security Council changed its agenda. It was about to have a meeting, and following the screening of the film, which was attended by a number of very major UN leaders as well as world leaders, the Security Council shifted its agenda to include a discussion of international justice. So those were quantifiable things. Globally, the situation in Darfur now is worse than it was when we made the film. And things have gone from bad to worse for NGOs, and from terrible to nightmarish for the remaining citizens inside Darfur who are still in these camps, and who can feel good about that. So it's a mixed record about which I have very mixed feelings.
We have 2 minutes, unless we get kicked out.
I wonder why we do not have more investigative journalism on a judicial system in general, because I learned through my case that the law is banned, stretched, and ignored. I'm from Switzerland, And we do have the same thing now regarding with the FIFA, where, for instance, there's no documentary there. We had an issue in Switzerland with HSBC. HSBC was investigated about money laundering. It's not about helping with tax evasion. It was about money laundering. And the prosecution office decided to settle with the bank for 40 million Swisses. Now, in my view, or I believe in a general view of the man in the street, it does not understand the judicial system if it uses that abusive practice to make deals. And I'm pretty certain the investigation we have in Switzerland against the FIFA, where the Federal Prosecution Office is working on, I believe in 3-4 years the case will be closed, because it's the FIFA is a golden calf in Switzerland, just like Swiss bank secrecy. So, for instance, Swiss bank secrecy, I would never ever do house searches in Swiss banks.
No, this is an excellent question, and I'm glad it was raised before our time ran out. The threat of litigation and as a weapon used by potential subjects of, in my case, films, and for journalists, is an enormous inhibition on our ability to act, and was a huge factor in the way we had to operate during the making of Betting on Zero. I was joking with Richard before we spoke. I said, I thought that I had skied the triple black diamond of runs when I made the Darfur Now, in dealing with the government of Sudan and navigating an ongoing conflict that involved crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide. The film about Herbalife, Betting on Zero, was much, much more difficult, and the difficulties lay with the potential risk for litigation, which has in the United States much less to do with actual justice and a lot more to do with the capitalization of the players in the conflict. In this case, Herbalife and Pershing Square, which are respectively worth billions of dollars. And no one has explicitly threatened me with litigation, but there was an implicit danger, and I was cautioned by print reporters and members of establishment media, not fringe actors. I was cautioned that Herbalife likes to take people that they regard as opponents into court, and this was a factor we had to reckon with in our entire approach to the subject. And for documentary filmmakers whose status in American law is not as established as print journalists who are members of the First Amendment protected press, this is a much trickier question. Yeah, I'm sorry. Oh, because I could go on, because this was really thorny.
I love ending on litigation. I've had experience. What a group! What a group! Make sure you go see the films. Thank you. Thank you.
This film is sold out. I think your film is sold out. I think so, yeah.
Oh, so I can't go?
You can go. Okay, good. I think
you can have my seat, Rich. I'll stand. I know how it goes.
I'm sorry I had to cut you off.